All right, hello everybody again, and welcome to another DevOps.com webinar. I'm Jared Richter from DevOps.com, and today's webinar is titled The Unrealized Role of Monitoring and Alerting. Today's webinar is brought to you by our friends at VictorOps. Today we have joining us Jason Hand, DevOps Evangelist at VictorOps. How you doing today, Jason?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here and teach everybody a little bit about some monitoring and alerting stuff, so it's going to be great.
Excellent. Well, we're happy to have you, and we're looking forward to it, and take it away. It's all yours.
All right. Well, great. Like I said, my name is Jason Hand, and I'm the DevOps Evangelist here at VictorOps. For you who aren't familiar with what VictorOps is, we're an incident management platform focusing on helping teams not only know that there's a problem, but understand what that problem is and hopefully resolve and repair that issue quickly. But then kind of take it a little bit further than that and also include some efforts to actually understand and learn more about your systems and how you can improve those. So I'm really excited to talk to everybody today. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're chiming in from. One other thing I do want to kind of mention is that we will be sharing a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today online on Twitter. If you want, love for you to jump in with that conversation on Twitter as well. Just use the hashtag VOWebinar. And we will be sharing lots of stuff on there, and we hope that you can maybe join us in that conversation online as well. So I thought I'd, before I kind of dive into this, I want to give a little bit of a background as to how I came up with this talk or where this all sort of was inspired initially. Earlier this year I was at the Scale 14X conference in Pasadena, California. Great conference, especially for those of us that are in the web IT space or the IT operations space. Heavily focused on Linux, of course, but there's a lot of really great things going on there, a lot of great speakers. And I was invited to be part of a Birds of a Feather panel to discuss the sort of value that you can get out of monitoring and why we should be monitoring and alerting at all. And during that conversation, during that Birds of a Feather, there was a couple of people that were also on the panel that were sort of very adamant, very extremely sort of, I guess, focused on this idea that the main reason why we do any kind of alerting at all is really to just predict problems or to look for some sort of trend that may be taking us down the path towards some sort of a problem. And although I don't disagree with that, the fact that prediction and prevention is part of what we use monitoring and alerting for, there's really so much more that we could be doing with this. And so although I did my best to sort of chime in and give my 2 cents during that conversation, I felt like when I left that there were still a lot of people who didn't quite get a lot of value out of that Birds of a Feather conversation. And so I decided to go home and do some research and see if I could come up with a good way to really express my thoughts in terms of what is it that we're really missing when we talk about doing monitoring and alerting with our systems. And I'm sure there's a lot of us out there who have felt this way where we feel very strongly about a certain concept or a certain idea, and we spend a lot of time just sort of finding the ways to come up with the right language to get that out there. And so anyway, I did this research, and I spent a couple of weeks sort of collecting my thoughts and doing a bunch of outreach to different practitioners in the area, or in this field, I should say. And one of the things that I came across, again, this is something that a lot of people use and leverage for all kinds of great information, but there's the 2015 monitoring survey. And this survey is something that James Turnbull he's a CTO over at Kickstarter, he does every year. He puts together this survey, and he reaches out to a lot of different people in our industry, and he asks a bunch of different questions regarding monitoring. And so just a couple of quick graphics from that survey. I thought I'd start by showing you who exactly is responding to this survey in general. And you can see that most of the responses were from people in operations roles, or maybe they identify themselves more as a DevOps, and it's really nice to see that there are some managers in there who are responding to this type of stuff as well. So using this information, I thought I'd see if I could find something to sort of back up my argument here. But one of the things that I looked at was, first of all, one of the questions was, why are you collecting this data? And I have to note here that those who responded to the survey were able to choose more than one. And so the options were performance analysis and trending, fault anomaly detection, capacity planning, or A/B testing, or we don't collect metrics at all. And so the results of this, for me, again, didn't quite really back up my argument here. So they were a little bit troubling. But to be fair, there really wasn't an option that was made available for sort of the things that we're going to be talking about today. But you can see that in general, most people are doing monitoring and alerting primarily for performance analysis and trending and fault and anomaly detection. You know, and a big reason why performance analysis and the trending, along with fault and anomaly detection, were chosen is because many of us have to pay a very close attention to our service level agreements. And I can go on and on about service level agreements and whether or not they're valuable or whatever. That's a completely different talk. But the fact is that most of us, or in most cases, our personal and our departmental goals and incentives are designed around trying to provide maximum availability, or this idea of high availability. And so as a result, prediction and prevention is actually where a lot of our focus ends up going. And so many of us become more like these high-tech maintenance workers, or maybe more like firefighters, you know, focus more really on maintaining this, you know, sense of a high availability, whether 5 nines availability or something along those lines. And this is a big reason why the DevOps movement has become so important. IT teams are incentivized on different things. Our developers want to ship code as quickly as possible. Operations want to maintain stable systems. And so we've got this, you know, sort of back and forth, and we've got this resistance. And of course, like I said, the prevention and the prediction of problems and looking for anomalies and that kind of thing is very important. But it's not really the only thing that we should be looking at. Focusing primarily on prevention and prediction doesn't really address something that's much more important than simply just maximum uptime. And so I threw this slide in here because although it's funny, I think it is sort of accurate in that a lot of times we don't really pay much attention to what it is that the company needs. What is this question mark that's in between collecting underpants or doing whatever it is within our business opportunities, and then actually providing real profit to the company, or providing, you know, some sort of market gain and that kind of thing. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the objectives of the business? What is it that the business is actually trying to achieve? That's sort of, you know, the question that is sometimes overlooked when we focus more on just prevention and prediction. Well, first of all, when it comes to business objectives, every company wants to try to maintain their customers. They want to keep their existing customers extremely happy. We've all heard the saying that, you know, it's easier to keep a customer than it is to gain a new one. And of course, you know, customers, they do care about uptime. They want to make sure that when they go in and use our service, or if they've got, especially if their business relies on our service, they want to make sure that that service is available, you know, highly available, and for the most part, always available for them to use when they need it. But what else are companies concerned with? What's missing from that, you know, that simple statement? Well, the fact is that customers and users, they do want that availability, but they also want the new stuff. They want new features. They want new functionality. They want to know that the services that they're using, they're relying on, oftentimes paying for, aren't going to just stay the same over time. They're actually going to start to innovate. So that kind of takes us back to our question of, well, what is this giant question mark here in the middle of the gnome's sort of business model? And what's this missing piece that leads us to the growth and the market leadership and of course, the profits? Well, the question mark is, it turns out, this idea of continuous improvement. And a lot of this requires a shift in thinking. It's really a cultural shift in a lot of cases. To put this focus more on an improvement kata, or the continuous improvement, which, by the way, leads to all kinds of opportunities, you know, like with the initiatives such as continuous integration, continuous deployment, automation, all these types of things. Those actually end up being byproducts of having a strong focus on continuous improvement. We don't have to look far in the past to find examples of companies who didn't put this kind of focus that they needed on continuous improvement, and these organizations no longer exist. Blockbuster, rest their soul, is no longer with us, and the question is, why are they no longer around? Well, they failed to innovate, and as a result, you know, they didn't have a focus, because they didn't have a focus on continuous improvement, they were replaced by other services. So the online streaming services out there, such as Netflix and Amazon, Hulu, and others, those are now providing the services that people wanted and demanded over time, and Blockbuster was primed to try to provide that, but they didn't place a focus on continuous improvement. They didn't try to go out and innovate and come up with new features, new functionality of their services, and as a result, Blockbuster no longer exists. The same goes for Kodak. Kodak was, for a long time the market leader in all things photography, and they could have maintained that if they just would have had a lot more focus on the ideas of continuous improvement. They would have had this opportunity to provide the services that now companies like Instagram and Snapchat and Flickr and lots of others are all providing. Kodak could have been providing that same service, and they also could be still around today. Last example I've got for you is, Borders. Borders was a market leader in the place where we go to grab, whatever books we're looking for. And of course now Amazon is primarily where we go to both purchase hard copy books, but ebooks as well. And so this failure to continuously improve and learn is a large contributing factor to the demise of companies everywhere. And I think a lot of folks, a lot of companies are starting to realize that and starting to see that. And we're seeing articles start to pop up the place in lots of different places telling us or warning us that this failure to innovate is actually what's killing off a lot of our companies. And so the message of today is that IT teams need to place a higher priority on learning. And this learning, with this priority on learning, that's going to lead to improving, which then leads to innovating. And monitoring and alerting actually plays a huge role in those efforts. So by continuously understanding and responding to the feedback from monitoring, logging, and alerting, that kind of thing, this allows us to use the information about events in the past to actually drive future decisions and future actions. Every year, Puppet Labs puts out their State of the DevOps report. And here's a little snippet from last year's, and I thought I'd show one of the key findings that includes this idea that high-performing IT organizations experience 60 times fewer failures and recover from failure 168 times faster than their lower-performing peers. And they also, by the way, deploy 30 times more frequently with 200 times shorter lead time. Now, the part that I find interesting here is highlighted, and hopefully you can read that, but if not, I'll read it for you. And it's that the failure is unavoidable, but how quickly you detect and recover from that failure can mean the difference between leading the market and struggling to catch up with competition. So the key takeaway there is that it's not just about prediction and prevention. It's actually more about how are you able to respond and repair quickly. Responding to and then repairing service disruptions quickly should be our new focus. But previously, IT operations had to take a hard stance when it comes to allowing developers to introduce code into our production servers or into our production systems. And a big reason is because that they were extremely risk averse. Our IT operations teams or just our ops teams are incentivized on maintaining stability, and they try to prevent these problems. They try to make sure, because they are so highly focused on uptime and availability, they take a very hard stance in the changes that make their way into production. But now we're starting to shift away from this idea of preventing and engineering failure out of our systems and more towards being able to actually recover from failure quickly. So we've switched our focus away from the idea of mean time between failure, or trying to increase the time or the distance in between failures of our systems, whether that's a small system failure or even like a Sev1 outage, and actually focus more on the mean time to recover or the mean time to repair. And the reason is that we've come to realize now that failure is inevitable, it is unavoidable, it's just part of complex systems, which of course is what we're building. And no matter how much we focus on prediction and prevention, problems are going to occur. Our systems are complicated and complex, and as a result, failure is sort of the new normal. It's just sort of what we understand is part of operating, building, maintaining, supporting, and improving complex systems, which of course is what we are designing and building these days. But the good news is that success is a result of failure in a lot of ways. As long as there is a focus on repairing quickly and learning from it, improvements can be made, which is going to help all of our efforts in the long run. So with this new focus on learning and improving, our systems become better over time. And therefore, because they've become better over time, they actually become a lot more resilient. And that's a big reason, or that's a big thing that a lot of us are trying to focus on these days anyway, is rather than trying to make our systems extremely hardened, unable to fall over, we're actually starting to build our systems so that they're more resilient. And by resilient, I mean that they're very flexible. They can actually absorb and recover from these failures or these problems, or maybe have less of an impact in certain areas or to smaller groups of users. So resiliency becomes sort of the focus in a lot of ways as well. Now the whole thing about this for a lot of folks, and a lot of you may be sort of cringing as you're listening to this webinar, is that change is very scary. But in order to innovate, change is absolutely required. So that's sort of the conflict that we've been struggling with, and that DevOps and the DevOps principles are out to sort of address, is that there's this big internal conflict within our organizations where a lot of us are trying to push out new innovations, new features, new functionality, but other parts of our company, other parts of our IT organizations are actually trying to prevent that from happening. And of course, all of us probably understand that in order to change, or in order to actually innovate and deal with these conflicts, we have to change. We have, it's part of the requirements of innovation. And without the ability to do so, without the ability to actually explore and innovate and look for ways to change, the idea of progress just simply isn't possible. And so one way to take steps towards this innovation is actually to put more focus on the learning. And I'm not just talking learning from failure, but also learning from success. But for the purposes of our talk today, we're talking more about monitoring and alerting, which of course helps us understand when things fail or what's happening as things fail. But we want to learn from the recovery efforts, and that includes all of the data that's part of your monitoring and alerting. Postmortems and learning reviews, obviously these are big hot topics. We could have a whole discussion on just postmortems and learning reviews today. But they're really one of the best places to start when you're talking about how is it that we want to start looking for ways to learn and improve. We want to take a closer look at what took place during the recovery efforts of whatever sort of problem we may have had. And there's a series of questions that we want to ask during these learning reviews and postmortems. We want to know who all was involved, who was part of the recovery efforts, because we want to hear from everybody. We want to hear from all the stakeholders, all the people that were involved. That's not going to be just IT operations. That's going to be all kinds of areas of the company, even maybe our marketing teams or those that are part of our customer support and customer success teams, because they're going to have information that's also relevant to what was taking place during the recovery efforts. We want to know, what did they see? What was everybody's story individually, because everybody has different context in terms of what was taking place. But we want to try to capture what everybody was seeing. We also want to know what was said. What was the conversations that were taking place during those recovery efforts, because there's a lot of great, there's a wealth of information in those conversations that took place. We also want to know, what were the actions that the operators were taking? What types of commands were they running? And this is where ChatOps comes into place, and why a lot of teams are starting to love this idea of ChatOps, because they're able to capture so much more detail about exactly what took place, and it's all time-stamped and it's all included right there with the conversations. And so that's, again, why a lot of people really do sort of move a lot of their conversations and a lot of their actions into persistent group chat, because all of that is captured in real time, and it makes these learning reviews and these postmortems so much easier to put together. So we start to see how things correlate, because conversations, information, and the actions are all captured. They're time-stamped, like I said, and they're all in line with each other over time. And that helps us really start to correlate what took place during those recovery efforts. And then, after an incident, a lot of teams, they implement this this exercise that we've come to know as the 5 whys exercise. And the reason is they're trying to get to the bottom of what's taking place or what took place during some sort of problem. So they set off in this attempt to isolate the root cause. Now, like I said earlier, the systems that we build and design are extremely complex, and we know now, that failure is inevitable, but we also know that in complex systems, there actually isn't going to be a root cause. In a complex system, there's going to be a lot of contributing factors to some sort of issue. And so for those of you who are still very much focused on the root cause, I got a little bit of a cautionary tale here that the biggest root cause is actually you, because of your real strong focus on trying to identify something that actually doesn't exist. Now, I will admit that if you just have to identify a single source of a problem, well, that single source or that root cause of an issue is simply just change, because change is implemented and it's ongoing and it's constantly going on within our systems. And so I urge you to sort of move away from this idea of, well, there has to be a root cause and there has to be some sort of corrective action, because in the systems that we're building and designing, that just simply isn't the case. And if you think that you've landed on a root cause, you've actually just stopped asking questions, and you've stopped sort of seeking out new things that you can learn from your systems so that you can improve those systems and innovate. And another big thing, another reason why we sort of urge people and urge teams to move away from root cause analysis and more towards learning reviews and postmortems is that when we focus on root cause and when we focus on trying to identify just this single thing, in a lot of cases we end up blaming or sort of assigning blame to other members of our team. And the problem with that, the problem with this root cause analysis and the 5 whys is that it tends to lead to blame. Even if we set out and we try to say, well, nobody's at fault here, by asking questions such as why, that actually just inherently leads to blame, which we want to avoid, because the thing about blame is that it leads to operators that were involved in the recovery efforts actually starting to hide really important information about what took place during those recovery efforts. And there's nothing worse than us not really having a full understanding of exactly what took place. And so if our operators are afraid to chime in and tell us what they know, what they saw, what they did, then we're actually not going to be able to learn much from what took place, and we're not going to be able to improve our systems. One thing that's really important to remember when we do these post-incident analysis is that the team is doing their very best given the constraints of their system. So that's another reason why we want to avoid blaming and the 5 whys as well, is that the system itself is going to have inherent problems in it. There's going to be constraints that have been designed into the system, whether it's on purpose or not. And the operators and those that are involved in recovery efforts, we have to remember that they are doing their very best that they can. And so if there's any kind of problems that we uncover and things that we want to improve, it's not related to any specific person or team. It's actually related to the systems themselves. So when we conduct these postmortems, it needs to be made extremely clear that we are here to learn. That's the main thing. And I'll point out that we're not just here to learn from failure, we're also here to learn from success. So even during recovery efforts, if you're able to restore services in a very quick manner, we do want to do a learning review or a postmortem on that, because there is a lot of great, there's a wealth of information in there. There's a lot of data and learning to be had, even from success, which is oftentimes forgotten. In most cases, a lot of teams will only perform their postmortems or their learning reviews in the event of some sort of bad failure. So rather than attempting to avoid failure, the new sort of method is actually to understand what's the story. So we need to understand the story, what took place from the moment an issue was detected all the way through the resolution. And what we're doing here is we're actually leveraging feedback loops. And a feedback loop is actually something else I would love to talk more with all of you about. We can go on, do another webinar about that for another hour. But the thing is that with these feedback loops, they lead to opportunities to learn as we step through this, and I'll go a little bit more in depth on the feedback loops here in a moment. But by stepping through these feedback loops or making sure you're leveraging feedback loops, it actually opens up opportunities to learn, which then allows you to innovate. And so, and by innovate, I want to point out that we're learning from both success and failure in order to develop and implement new, small, incremental improvements. One key thing to remember is we're not trying to solve huge problems. We're not trying to boil the ocean, as they say. We're trying to uncover small, incremental enhancements or improvements to just make our system a lot more or a little bit more resilient, which then over time makes them a lot more resilient and highly available. You may have heard of this term called the learning organization, which I think is starting to kind of catch on more and more, especially within larger enterprise companies. It's already sort of baked in a lot of cases to small companies that are part of, they're startups or they just have smaller teams and it's a little bit easier for them. But becoming a learning organization is actually a huge focus for companies who realize that they need to innovate in order to stay competitive. They don't want to be the next Blockbuster. They don't want to be the next Kodak. And the thing about learning is that true learning doesn't actually come from reading and listening, or even going to conferences and listening to lectures or presentations, or even chiming in or tuning in to listen to me to give you some sort of webinar. There's actually a lot more to learning, and the key thing about learning is that it requires doing. Until you've actually taken action, you're really not going to fulfill the actual learning that you're seeking. And so now we're back here to the OODA loop again, so the feedback loop that we had talked about. And if we look at this a little closer, we see that action is at the very end of this loop. And so the reason, or the one thing I want to point out here, is that until you have that action, you actually have not really placed yourself in a position to learn much at all. And I thought I'd illustrate this with an example. I myself, personally, I'm a musician. I play guitar, and in the past year or so, I've started to try to learn how to play the dobro guitar. And the dobro guitar is just it's a resonator guitar that you set on your lap. And even if you are a guitarist, it's something that you can't really just pick up and immediately learn. It's a little bit difficult. And so anyway, I set out to try to learn how to play the dobro guitar. And of course, I go out and I get all kinds of sheet music, and I get books and all kinds of stuff, and I read it all and I absorb it all as quickly as I can. But it isn't until I actually put the dobro in my hands, on my lap, and actually start to begin doing something that I have any opportunity to learn something at all. And that includes failing. Once you start putting an instrument that you're not familiar with, you're going to mess up a lot. There's going to be a lot of sour notes. There's going to be a lot of just odd noises that come from that instrument. But that's all part of the learning process. It's something that you just have to actually do, and that applies to everything. So the thing is, we go from these ideas of knowing to understanding something and then into learning, and all that requires action. And also, a side note, it also requires making mistakes. I don't think there's anybody who's ever learned any instrument who has suddenly just read a book and then all of a sudden knew exactly how to play that instrument. Now, if we take a look at this operational metrics maturity scale here, we see that as teams move their focus away from maintaining to improving and then to innovating, they actually begin to bring more value to not only their teams and the organization, but also the tools that they're using for monitoring and alerting. And so you can see here, you start off in the lower part of the quadrant, or the lower part of the scale, where things are a lot more chaotic. And then as you move up through the beginning and the growing and the exploring phases, we go into defining and then knowing and then understanding and then finally into learning. Well, how do we know if we're doing any of this right? How do we know if we're actually starting to learn something? Or how do we know, even what to do? Well, one of the things that we mentioned earlier is that postmortems or learning reviews are extremely useful. That's a great place to start for sure. But what do your postmortems look like? Are they actually setting you up to learn anything? And we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but do they tell the story? That's sort of the key thing about a learning review, is that you really want to capture the story. You want to get context and conversations from lots of different people. Like I mentioned earlier, we want to know what they're seeing, what they're saying, maybe any kind of commands that they may be executing. But then we also want to make sure that part of that learning review or part of that postmortem is that we walk away with some small incremental improvements. Those are going to be our action items and the things that we want to actually make sure somebody's going to do in the short term and then follow up on that as well. So now you can see that we're starting to shift our gaze away from maintaining and protecting systems and actually more towards this idea of learning and innovating. And because of this, because of these efforts, we now are setting ourselves up to increase value of the monitoring and alerting tools that we use. We're also increasing the value of our IT teams. We're increasing the value of the products and the services that we're building and providing. And of course, we're increasing the value of the organization. And all because we moved our gaze away from prevention and prediction of failure and more towards learning from failure and understanding what can we do to not only learn but innovate and move forward. And the reason is, once we've sort of shifted our gaze away from that and focused more on this idea of creating hypotheses and exploring and experimenting in different things, and of course failing is going to be a big part of that, only then are we able to learn something and then try again. And that's how we sort of like step through the feedback loops and actually innovate and improve over time. So with this new focus on learning and innovating, we now can uncover new ways of building, deploying, and maintaining infrastructure, which then leads to resilient systems. And like I said earlier, resilient systems is kind of, what we were looking for in the first place, but the byproduct of a highly resilient system is, does anybody know? Now I wish I was able to just get everybody to like give me an answer or something real quick. But the byproduct of a highly resilient system is a highly available system. And that's kind of what we were after in the first place. If you remember, we talked about how teams have this really strong focus on uptime and high availability and the 5 nines and all that. Well, it turns out that if you have a focus on building resilient systems through organized and efforts more towards learning and innovating, suddenly your systems become more resilient, and as a result, your systems become much more highly available. So the main message today is that in many cases, we underutilize our monitoring and our alerting efforts. And because of this, because of this sole focus on prediction and prevention, not only are we not able to learn and innovate previously, now teams are able to give that focus towards actually not only the learning and the innovating, but finding out new ways to leverage metrics and leverage information that's all there and available within our monitoring and alerting. But previously, teams, organizations, they were not ever really going back and sifting through that data, trying to understand the conversations, trying to understand the stories of what took place, and as a result, they weren't really fully realizing the true potential and the true value of those tools, and as a result, they weren't realizing the true value of their IT organizations, the services and the things that they're building, and of course the organization in general. So that's kind of wrapping up the main thing I wanted to make today, or the main points that I wanted to make today. And so hopefully, a lot of you, this will give you some ideas on what you could be doing to sort of leverage the monitoring tools that you're using, the logging tools that you're using, the alerting tools that you're using. Maybe that's VictorOps. Maybe that's something else that you've built. But being able to take that data and then analyze that in some sort of post-incident analysis so that you can then take that information and learn from it, that's going to help you understand a lot more about your system. It's going to help you actually improve your system, which leads to a more resilient system, which then also leads to a lot more innovation and making sure that your organization and your products that you're building are all part of things that are just growing and improving all over time, and therefore the company that you're with is actually going to hopefully stay a leader in the space, a leader in the market, or maybe even make gains in the market. So that's all I've got. I'm going to hop off this train here, and we're going to get into our questions and answers section. So I thank you for your time. Follow me on Twitter, Jason. I'm just Jason Hand on Twitter, and of course DevOps.com on Twitter as well. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Jared, and let's see what kind of questions we might have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason. That was great. We're going to take some questions from the audience. Jason, the first question I have is, what are some suggestions around introducing change into your organization?
Some suggestions to introducing change into your organization. Well, it kind of depends on where the focus of the change is. I mean, the first thing, obviously, is if you're not using some sort of monitoring and logging and alerting is within the realm of DevOps. I mean, one of the big things, we all know the CAMS model of culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. So one of the big things, if you're not already doing it, is to implement some sort of monitoring and metrics. And let me add a little caveat there. Simply or putting monitoring and alerting in place is really just this idea that we want to collect all this data. It really doesn't do anybody any good to sit there and stare at dashboards or constantly looking at logs, but you're going to want that context later on when you do shift your focus away from trying to prevent things and actually wanting to learn things. So we see the meme out there of monitor all the things. It's really more like collect all the things. So I would urge or encourage organizations and teams that maybe don't have a strong focus on monitoring to put some things in place. At least start monitoring things for complete outages and things that are actually actionable. You don't really want to be alerted on something that an operator or someone can't take action on. And the reason is, there's lots of different reasons, but the primary reason I think is that whenever there's a lot of unactionable alerts coming out of our monitoring, that tends to lead towards a lot of alert fatigue, which then can lead to burnout, which we all know is not something that any of us want to deal with, and we don't want to lose any of our great talent. So I would say one of the biggest changes, definitely implement some sort of monitoring. I also think that putting a focus on being extremely collaborative and making sure that your conversations are in an open space where a lot more of the team can be part of that conversation. This is a big reason, we talked about chat ops earlier, but this is a big reason why teams are moving away from chat tools that don't allow for persistent conversations to exist and sort of grow over time. So tools like HipChat, Slack, of course, are the tools that teams are starting to use, because they do find that as they make their conversations that are internal, as they make those a lot more collaborative and a lot more open to more within the teams, that there's a lot more efficiency that comes from that. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, because those conversations are all there and they're all captured with relevance to what we're doing during recovery efforts, all of that's ready and available for our postmortems or our learning reviews. So I would say monitoring and also trying to move a lot of conversations into a more collaborative space.
Excellent. All right, I got some more questions that are coming in rapid fire right now. Jason, how do you mix storytelling with ticketing like Mantis?
Storytelling with ticketing like Mantis. So I'm not really familiar with Mantis, but I can say, just speak to sort of ticketing systems in general. I guess I should back up and point out that a lot of the things that we're kind of talking about today, when it comes to incident management, we're really talking about things that need to be addressed immediately. And of course, ticketing systems are there to sort of track what changes we need, our change management, that kind of thing, making sure that there's a lot of visibility up throughout management and they understand what's being done and that kind of thing. I guess it probably depends on the tools that you're using, but if we switch back to sort of the concept of chat ops, in a lot of cases there, you're going to be able to have those conversations, but also immediately sort of trigger an event that creates a ticket, whether that's in Mantis or some other service. And I feel like those tickets are really sort of set off to the side. They're really there for management to be able to follow up and have visibility into stuff. But those are probably going to be issues that aren't nearly as urgent as the type of stuff we're talking about today. If you're having some sort of issue, some sort of service disruption within your organization, whether that's an internal or maybe your e-commerce site is down, we really don't have time to be submitting tickets and taking time to fill out forms as to what we need to do or what we think need to do. We actually need to recover as quickly as possible. So I would sort of urge, I know it's hard, especially in larger organizations, I would sort of urge that teams sort of move away from ticketing systems, especially when it comes to the types of issues that we're talking about today. Now, if there's some sort of problem that really doesn't have a sense of urgency, of course, ticketing makes perfect sense. But the types of stuff we're talking about today, where your company is probably hemorrhaging money for every second that there's an outage, a ticketing system is not going to help you at all.
Okay. Here's another question for you, Jason. Based on the maturity scale slide, does learning need to come from a prescriptive monitoring approach?
When it comes to DevOps in general, there's a lot of frustration because so many of us want a very prescriptive model. We want to know what are the procedures, what are the processes that we put in, what's the step-by-step to achieve this thing that we're learning about DevOps. And unfortunately, there is no prescriptive model. A lot of this stuff does not work when it's a push-down or top-down type of thing. And so I think any idea of prescription in terms of not only the metrics maturity scale and how you can do this learning stuff, most of that in my experience doesn't actually work. Now I will say that as you're doing things like you're doing some sort of internal training and you're sending a lot of your teams out to different conferences to learn, or they're tuning into these types of webinars. All that stuff is very useful and should be part of sort of the continuous learning efforts of an organization. And so with that, I guess that could be prescribed to a certain degree. But in general, it's something that I tend to think any sort of prescription-based model when it comes to DevOps historically has not worked for most teams that I've been involved with.
All right, here's a long one. Jason, building resilient systems. What are suggestions for large enterprises that has all sorts of systems like ERP, mainframe, AS400, custom systems, etc.? Oh, just one.
Okay.
Collecting data from all these heterogeneous systems itself is difficult. So any thoughts on how these organizations can transform into learning organizations?
Sure. Yeah, and this is a question we see a lot from the teams and the people that we work with and help. And there's this concept of bimodal IT out there, and whether you like that that term or not, I'm not particularly fond of it, but it does seem to work for a lot of organizations. And what it means really is that you've got a lot of systems out there that some of them are dinosaurs, they've been around forever, and we really just need to make sure that those systems do stay online and stay sort of maintained, and we don't want to touch them for fear of that change causing some sort of failure. But then there's other systems that maybe are a little bit more primed for us to go in and start implementing some of these things. So the bimodal IT sort of discussion is really a matter of sort of separating out some of the systems that you can begin to roll these types of focuses out onto, and those that you can't. And then over time, some of those older systems will begin to be the ones that you sort of target. So my advice is typically to start with the low-hanging fruit, some of the systems that are a little bit easier to get in and start monitoring, and there's maybe a lower risk of that impacting users over time if there is some sort of issue with that. And it's sort of it's a step-by-step type of thing where you focus on maybe your ERP system or whatever the case may be first, and then once you've got a good grip on how you're monitoring that, what are you doing to take that information that's in monitoring and alerting and get it in some sort of form of a postmortem or a learning review so that we can find innovations. Once you've sort of got your head wrapped around that or your arms wrapped around that, then maybe move on to the next system and sort of just begin to daisy chain these things together, and like I said, start with the low-hanging fruit and go from there.
Nice. All right, Jason, how can DevOps help with innovation?
Well, it's an interesting question. I feel like a big part of the DevOps principles and all these people out there, myself included, who advocate for all the DevOps sort of methodologies, is that through, if we look at the CAMS model, the automation, the measurement, the sharing, and a lot of people also include lean management in there as well. The sharing aspect of it is a huge piece, and as teams begin to sort of adopt the DevOps philosophies, we'll call it, and they do put a strong focus on sharing more about what took place, but also capturing what took place. That falls into the monitoring and the metrics part of that CAMS model. But when you've got a really strong focus on those types of things, particularly with the sharing stuff, all of a sudden the byproduct of that is that more teams are aware of what's going on. And through that awareness, there's a term situational awareness out there. Some like that term, some don't. But regardless of what you think, the awareness that's sort of spread and disseminated through teams through this like laser focus on sharing as much as possible, that really opens up the doors for learning, because you take that information, you take that knowledge, and then you sort of jam on that for a little bit, and that opens up the door for learning and innovation. It's all part of that feedback loop that we talked about earlier. So the sharing piece is a big part of it, and what is it that you're sharing though? And that's where the metrics and the monitoring stuff comes in. If we can take that information and make sure that that's spread out a lot of different teams, then all of a sudden the learning piece just becomes a little bit more natural. So to me, that's sort of how DevOps kind of plays its role in the innovation aspect of it, is that we're really taking a lot of the tribal information the tribal knowledge that's stuck in a lot of our subject matter experts' minds, and we're spreading that out across more of the IT organization, or more of the IT teams and the organization itself.
Great. All right, Jason, is there such thing as too much monitoring?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't do anyone any good to sit there and stare at things. I feel like no, I don't think there is too much monitoring. There is going to be a threshold where it's too much noise in terms of the alerting. But like I mentioned earlier, you're going to want that context. You're going to want that information when you do get to a place where you're trying to recover from some sort of outage, and certainly when you get into your postmortems. If you don't have that monitoring information or those logs, or just the data in general, it makes it a lot more difficult for you to really understand what took place, and therefore find areas of incremental improvement. So I don't believe, especially with the low cost of disk space these days, it's not that hard, it's not that expensive to collect a lot of data just so you can have it available over time. But you do want to pay attention to your alerting aspects of it and make sure that you're not alerting too much on things that really aren't actionable and things that just don't need to be taken care of at 3 or 4 in the morning. That's something that can wait until office hours the next day. That's going to be a lot smarter approach. But no, I don't think there is an idea of too much monitoring.
Excellent. All right, looks like let's see, we got one more. What do we got? All right, how can I sell my management team on failure? Looks like this is one of the last questions for the moment, but go ahead, Jason. We've got plenty of time. How can we sell a management team on failure?
Yeah, well, it is a difficult conversation to have, because just the idea of failure makes a lot of people nervous, because we don't like to hear about failure. We definitely don't want to inject failure, but the thing is, a lot of the high-performing IT teams out there, Netflix is a great example. They have their Simian Army, which is just a collection of a lot of different applications. They've got their Chaos Monkey, their Chaos Kong, and a number of other different tools that they use within their services that actually intentionally inject failure into their service so that they can learn how to deal with that failure in the event that something actually takes place for real in their production environment. So the idea of failure, although it is scary, it is something that we're learning now, that it's helping us understand our systems. It's helping us understand how we can learn from outages and recover from those problems as quickly as possible. So there's companies out there that do what's known as game days, which is essentially just setting aside one particular day and then injecting failure into the system and seeing how the team responds, and then learning from that. And it's really no different than practicing anything. So if you think of in terms of sports, teams have practices all the time, and they do drills, and they become a lot better at a lot of different things over time just by drilling in these different exercises. And the same applies to our systems. And so although it is scary, I think if you can sort of pitch it in a way, and hopefully, from today's webinar, you've got some things that you can take and share with your management. But if you can pitch it in a way that these failures, if we go about them in a smart way, they're going to uncover a lot of information about what's going on with our system, but they're also going to train us, they're going to train our teams how to respond when something fails. So maybe that's another big thing to sort of keep in mind or to communicate to management, is that you cannot engineer failure out of our complex systems. It's going to happen. So rather than run away scared from the idea of failure, we actually want to jump into it head first and learn how to deal from failure and recover quickly, so that when it does happen, we can actually deal with it in a smart way and make sure that it has a lower impact to our users, our customers, and our company in general.
That's some great advice. Excellent. We got some more questions coming in. Jason, any thoughts on going beyond monitoring and alerting on a failure to prediction and self-healing fixing? Is that a long shot?
Yeah, I mean, it's now you're sort of getting into the ideas that we hear about in terms of like AI and that kind of thing. And it's certainly there. A lot of the VictorOps users, actually, we've got a feature called the transmogrifier that allows for teams to sort of do a little bit of soft self-remediation. So you can put in some automation that says, when this particular service has a problem, if we know that step one to recover from that is to actually log into that host and maybe just restart the service, rather than paging somebody in the middle of the night so that they then will VPN into their network and then SSH into whatever the host is and then restart the service, you can actually let through the transmogrifier with VictorOps and maybe using a chatbot, you can go ahead and automate the steps of remediation. And there's a lot of teams that are starting to explore that, especially for services that it's safe to allow some sort of automated response and recovery efforts. So I think we're going to start seeing more and more of that. That's definitely a strong focus here at VictorOps, is making it so that, our motto here is that we try to make being on call suck less. And one of the things that sucks about being on call is that things tend to break in the middle of the night or at the worst possible time. And so if we can make that easier on operators and those who are part of being on call, that's sort of our focus. And so we're looking and exploring new ways to sort of make it a lot easier for teams to put in some rules that allow them to make efforts towards auto remediation or self-healing and that kind of thing. And I think we're going to start to see more and more. I know there's other tools and services that are actively trying to work on this. The thing is, a lot of it, especially when it comes to correlating events and correlating problems, it's very difficult. Artificial intelligence, although it's getting better, every day, it still has a long way to go, I think, before we're ready to implement those into our systems. At this point, and maybe for a very long time, we still need humans to get involved. And that's a big focus of VictorOps, is that there's a lot more to being on call than simply being paged. What happens next is really the bigger story. And then also, are you able to learn from these problems and learn from these failures? And it takes people to be involved in a lot of that. So I think it's coming, but I don't think it's here in the next year or so.
All right, Jay. So we got some more questions. They just keep coming. For the dev guys, what data should be important to have and count for the development to make them aware about the impact of their job?
Yeah, well, there's this idea of metrics-driven development, which I think is fascinating and I think is extremely important. Teams that are not maybe focusing on metrics-driven development, you might want to explore that a little bit, do some Googling, and you'll find some great blog posts out there from a lot of our partners who are talking and teaching about metrics-driven development. And really the idea is that you start implementing your monitoring tools and your logging and even your alerting earlier on in the software development lifecycle. So when the developers are out there, just starting to sort of fork off a new branch and begin developing the latest new feature, they should be leveraging monitoring and alerting during that phase as well. And there's a couple of reasons why. First and foremost, it familiarizes them with the monitoring and alerting tools. And of course, through a lot of the DevOps principles, a lot more developers and engineers are starting to be part of the on-call rotation. And the reason is that they have very good knowledge, they have very intimate insight into the code, of course. In a lot of cases, some of the incidents and the outages that we experience are due in part to the code that's out there in production. And so if I'm somebody who's being paged and I don't know that code very well, I'm just going to go find the developer or some developer who does. And so again, because we're trying to recover as quickly as possible, now developers are coming on call. And if they're going to be on call, they really need to have a deeper understanding of the tools that are at their disposal and the information that's available. So the monitoring, the logging, using tools like VictorOps, that should be something that developers are starting to explore and sort of use earlier on in their pipeline. And then that way, by the time it gets into the production systems, one, they've probably worked out all the kinks, they've cleaned up their code, because they don't want to be paged in the middle of the night. But when something does go wrong and they're the ones who are being paged and part of the remediation efforts, they're very familiar with all the tools. They know exactly what they're looking at. And again, that's going to help them recover a lot quicker. So that's sort of my advice, is to become really familiar with the monitoring and alerting. In terms of what types of things you should be monitoring for, of course, APM stuff, application process, using tools like New Relic and Datadog, and there's lots of different tools out there for that type of stuff. But it really sort of depends on what it is you're building and what it is that you care about. And of course, we always care about our customers and our users first, so we want to make sure their user experience is first and foremost at the top of our list of things to care about. And that, that's a whole other discussion right there. Of course, we want to pay attention to things like CPU and hard disk and network latency, but also we want to know what's the experience of the end user. If they're not able to do something and we don't capture that somewhere in a log and then alert on it, we're going to lose users, we're going to lose customers, and we're not even going to understand why. So it's important to start measuring and monitoring things that aren't necessarily the old-fashioned sort of metrics, but we want to start looking for things like bounce rates and unable to log in or unable to get to a certain page, because that's part of the experience, and that's really what the user cares about. A lot of cases they don't care about, well, in almost every case, they do not care about what our CPU load is. They don't care that our hard disks are filling out. They want to make sure that they can upload their latest picture, or that they can do, listen to music, or whatever's your service that you're providing. And if that's not happening, and if you're not monitoring for that, then you're missing out on a huge thing.
Great. Wow. A lot of great information. Looks like we are approaching the top of the hour, and we will be wrapping this up. Any questions, guys, that were not addressed in this broadcast will be forwarded to Jason and his team so they can respond individually. You can also reach Jason on Twitter at JasonHand, Jason, I want to thank you again for being here today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Once again, today's webinar was brought to you by VictorOps, and I'm Jared Richter from DevOps.com. Once again, this presentation and slides will be available on DevOps.com within 24 hours. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.